When Ralda, the Allfather, gave children to the mothers of mankind, he laid one language in all tongues and on all lips. This gift Ralda bestowed upon men to be used for letting each other know what must be avoided and what must be pursued to find happiness and hold it for eternity. Ralda is wise, good, and all-foreseeing. As he knew that luck and happiness must flee from earth when malice can deceive virtue, he attached an equitable property to this language. This property consists of the impossibility to tell lies or speak deceptive words without stammering or blushing, by which means the evil-hearted can instantly be identified. Because our language thus leads to luck and happiness, and helps beware of evil inclinations, its name, God's language, is fully justified, and all those who hold it in honor benefit from it. However, what happened? As soon as deceivers arose among our half-sisters and half-brothers, who presented themselves as God's servants, things instantly changed. The deceptive priests and the bitter, cruel princes, who always conspired together, wanted to live as they pleased and bypass God's laws. In their wickedness, they have invented different languages, so as to be able to speak secretly in the presence of others about all evil things and about all unworthy things, without a stammer betraying them or a blush tainting their faces. So what was born from that? Just as the seed of good herbs germinates under the ground when it was openly sown by good men in the bright of day, so time brings to light the harmful herbs that were sown by evil men in secret and in darkness. The dissolute girls and unmanly boys who prostituted themselves to the vile priests and princes elicited the new languages from their bed partners. That is how they spread among the peoples, until they altogether forgot God's language. Would you like to know what became of this? Now that stammering or the face no longer give away their evil thoughts, virtue has vanished from their midst. Wisdom followed, and freedom also left. Unity got lost, and discord took its place. Love has fled, and promiscuity shares a table with envy. And where once justice ruled, rules now the sword. All have become slaves, the populace of their masters, and the masters of envy, addictions, and greed." End quote. This powerful passage fascinates me, and it's a testament to the efficient communicative power of the Oera book, a text in which nearly every line seems crafted to be fundamentally informative or useful to readers of future generations. This is true to such an extent that even if I discovered beyond any shadow of a doubt that the work was a complete invention, I'd still want to share it far and wide, for the same reasons that parables of the sages are so important, or the greatest works of fiction writers of the highest order. This topic alone, that is to say the nature of language, its importance, and its role as both cause and effect of the health and harmony of a people or culture, is worthy of an entire video series. It's impossible to overstate the shaping and molding power of language. A people that prize justice and noble virtues will, if left to their own devices, inevitably and naturally over many generations, craft a language that reflects an honest and genuine nature. A people for whom shrewdness and guile and intrigue are paramount will craft a very different sort of language over time. And while the former language may be vastly superior with regard to cultivating harmony and balance and high culture, the latter would be far more effective as a utilitarian tool for gaining power. Languages are essentially an outward manifestation of a people's inner character, and develop according to their highest aims and values. To give a random example, scholars now speculate that Yiddish isn't just, quote, bad German, but also contains a mixture of Iranian and Slavic influence, and was likely developed by Ashkenazi merchants on the Silk Road as a means of being able to discuss business matters without outsiders understanding what was being communicated. It apparently contains over 250 words related to buy or sell. for the same reason that early steppe people's vocabularies had so much horse and wagon or chariot verbiage, and perhaps why the OLB language is so oriented towards water and sailing, with the term steersman being used well over 30 times throughout. Even the most seemingly simple anecdotes in the work carry powerful and straightforward lessons. Quote, "Imagine there was once a peat fire. 3 children had climbed onto a gravestone to escape it. Wind stoked up the fire. They screamed and their mothers were desperate. Then Adela came, crying, 'What are you waiting for? Try to help them and Ralda will give you strength.' She hurried to the thicket, grabbed some alder trunks, and built a bridge. Then the others came to help save the children. They return here every year with flowers." End quote. Such a simple story, yet one that so purely and directly communicates the concept that when you're certain you're acting in a net positive manner, according to God's will or higher principles, you must proceed, and in doing so, you'll be granted an unshakable strength and confidence. In conveying such stories and ideas, and virtues and conceptions, they seem to understand clearly that if a time should come in which they lost control of the narrative, or in which they ceased to be their own storytellers, this would mark an existential setback like no other. Quote, "Because I speak from the heart, and time will prove me right, if you want your children to remain true Frias, not to be conquered by either intrigue or force of arms, then make sure your daughters become real Freya women. Teach the children how great our lands once were, how great our ancestors were, how great we still are compared to others. Tell them of our heroes, of their heroic deeds, and of distant sea voyages. These tales must be told at the hearth, outdoors or anywhere else, in times of joy or tears." End quote. And I don't think this was voiced for reasons of arrogance, but for reasons of utility. A focus on the ideal and human greatness as a means to inspire future generations to seek to emulate the examples. A people stripped of such inspiration are a people paralyzed, weak, and fading. Modern storytellers, those who craft the narratives and storylines for movies or television, have taken to glorifying the, quote, "everyman." But of course, this comes with a hidden cost. A culture that turns its back on its heroes eventually becomes a culture incapable of producing heroes, one that gravitates away from human greatness and towards a cynical nihilism. There's another segment of the text in the OLB, from a quote shared in a previous video, that I've come to believe might be deeply significant. In speaking of the corrupt princes and priests that seem so intent on their destruction, quote, "These know that we are their greatest enemies, because we dare speak about freedom, justice, and royal obligations." End quote. These last 2 words are striking. Firstly, one can't help but wonder what is meant by the term royal. Secondly, the term obligations, which so well illustrates the uniqueness of their doctrine and mindset. Power is approached as the ultimate responsibility, not a privilege, something to be shouldered as a benevolent shepherd seeking the betterment of all peoples. With regard to the modern path of our church, it's become more common in recent decades to speak of a, quote, Judeo-Christian ethic in the West. But many Christians may be shocked to discover that the most beloved rabbi of the modern era, whose funeral in 2013 was the largest ever in Israel, repeatedly spoke in glowing terms about the enslavement of all non-Jews. Quote, "Goyim were born only to serve us. Without that, they have no place in this world." And, quote, "Why are Gentiles needed? They will work, they will plow, they will reap. We will sit like an effendi and eat. That is why Gentiles were created." End quote. I sincerely believe these to be opposite ends of the ideological spectrum. The moment power ceases to be wielded by a loving hand is the moment cultural and spiritual degeneration begins to set in, and the Oera book positively radiates with this understanding. And yet, this loving hand needs to be strong, wise, and far-sighted. Because truly benevolent leadership seeks the improvement and betterment of the human condition, it must act prudently. It can't be an enabler of bad behaviors, or act in a manner that fails to consider the consequences. If one gives a hungry man a fish instead of teaching him to fish, they may actually be doing more harm than good, and furthering his dependent instincts. If a dangerous and wounded wild animal is taken into a home and ends up mauling a young child, this isn't an act of kindness in the broadest sense, even if the impetus was to help, but rather one of immature irresponsibility. And this is the stark contrast between the timeless wisdom expressed here relative to what passes for wisdom in our age. A fatherly wisdom, actively considering the ramifications of one's actions in totality, relative to what seems to be a more one-dimensional expression of superficial love or kindness that may cause an individual to feel virtuous and yet have profoundly net negative results in the longer term. When such behavior becomes incentivized and socially advantageous, it then becomes endemic, and individuals everywhere, especially those most ambitiously seeking power and influence, begin to engage in destructive and degenerative behavior, presented or framed as the opposite. As individuals become more dependent, atomized, and domesticated, they're far more likely to outsource their thinking to a consensus-based expert class. And often this expert class swiftly becomes a cherry-picked selection of those men proven to be the most malleable, most willing to serve money, social advancement, and thus, ultimately, those forces pulling the strings behind the scenes. In the culture the OLB speaks to, foresight, coupled with healthy perspective and orientation, was all important. In the section subtitled How We Lost Our Denmarks, they speak of a subset of their people refusing to heed the warnings to avoid excessive trade of an unhealthy sort with neighboring populations. Necessities and fundamentals were traded away to foreign peoples, even weapons and in some cases storehouses of food, in exchange for things like jewelry and exotic adornments, only to have an exceptional famine then set in. Quote, "Their bodies were nicely decorated, but their warehouses were empty. Just 100 years after the day that the first ship with provisions had left, poverty and deprivation entered through the windows. Hunger spread its wings and landed. Discord marched loudly through the streets and into the houses. Love became homeless and unity deserted. The children wanted food, but their mothers had only jewelry." End quote. The corrupt princes of neighboring regions were thus able to get their foot in the door, due to a lack of vigilance, greed, and poor judgment. They seem to have seen, clearly, the power of money, specifically as a tool of conquering by indirect means. And again, their mindset here is very reminiscent of the Spartans, and of the earliest accounts of the Scythians. Which brings us to another interesting topic. Quote, "The nation of the Scythians was always regarded as very ancient, though there was a long dispute between them and the Egyptians concerning the antiquity of their respective races. The Egyptians, being confounded by these arguments, the Scythians were always accounted the more ancient." End quote. You may recall this quotation from the previous video on the Scythians. I mention it again because a curious parallel appears in Herodotus. Quote, "Now, before Psammetichus became king of Egypt, the Egyptians deemed themselves to be the oldest nation on earth. But from this point, he desired to learn, on becoming king, what nation was oldest. They have considered that, though they came before all other nations, the Phrygians are older still." End quote. This Egyptian king then supposedly devises a strange, and some might say cruel, test. Taking 2 newborn children, he gave them to a local shepherd to raise in complete isolation, to avoid exposure to all spoken language. Quote, "He desired to hear what speech would first break from the children when they were past the age of indistinct babbling." End quote. At long last, it's said that both of the children began to use the Phrygian word for bread, and the Egyptians are said to have been convinced the Phrygians were the more ancient of the two. I mention this not only because the striking similarity with the Scythian anecdote is fascinating, even hinting that these two people groups may have been conflated with one another, but also to point to a possible connection to the Phryans of the OLB and the Phrygians of the modern age. they had a tradition of a, quote, great mother, which later developed, one might say degenerated, into outright worship, in the guise of Sibyl in ancient Greece. Strabo considered them part of a wider Thraco-Phrygian grouping of peoples, and Homer called them the, quote, people of Atreus and godlike Mygdon, being one of the many writers that equates them with the Mygdones and Bebryces, both being Indo-European peoples thought to have come from the Balkans. Gordius, of legend, was a Phrygian king, responsible for the famed Gordian knot, which Alexander the Great later untied before going on to conquer most of the known world. They also have very strong connections to Troy, and keep in mind their storied Phrygian cap has been associated with powerful notions of freedom and liberty to this day. And it's not just the Phrygians, but probable connections seem to exist to several ancient peoples with the PH prefix. The Phocians, the Phociaeans, even the Phoenicians, as mentioned earlier, are cited in the OLB very directly as a mixed or bastardized offshoot, a people they mention as having taken to owning and trading slaves in large numbers, who they then heavily intermarried with over time. Much like the Phrygian people, the Phoenicians are spoken of as an excessively wide-ranging seafaring race, and though the references are sparse and sporadic, the historical record seems to indicate they gradually became more corrupt and degenerate, eventually leading to open conflict. Like the Phrygian people, or perhaps as offshoots or subsidiaries of them, they were likely responsible for many of the incredibly large-scale mining operations, many of which have remained an ignored mystery to this day, in places like Cornwall, Wales, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Some even believe the exceedingly large mining operations on the east coast of North America and into the Great Lakes region are a result of one or both of these people. The Phrygians speak of a custom of banishing the most criminal elements to mining territories, and thus speaks of Britain in their day as the land of the banished. And they also mention, clearly, avoiding metal and resource extraction for the purpose of mere profit, but rather only for common use. It's easy to imagine a population subset no longer wanting to abide by such restrictions and becoming a breakaway merchant class, but this is pure speculation on my part. The Phociaean connection may be one of the most interesting of all. Outside of the very oldest root historical works, there exists little mention of these people. But the manner in which they're mentioned is fascinating. Firstly, their historical record as a people, as told by several different ancient historians, seems to tally very closely with the Phrygian race in the OLB. Herodotus calls the Phociaeans the first Greeks to make long sea voyages. And then there are the semi-legendary Phaeacians, whom Homer's Odyssey marks out as excellent sailors, living in a location beyond the Pillars of Hercules, as the furthest point in his journey before returning. It speaks of Odysseus, quote, after a perilous voyage of 20 days upon a raft, he is to reach fertile Scheria, the land of the Phaeacians, who are near of kin to the gods, and will honor him as though he were one of ourselves, end quote. Some scholars, having examined the work and the geography of Homer, have suggested that Scheria was located in the Atlantic Ocean. Among them were both Strabo and Plutarch. Some even speculate this Scheria might be the Shelled Estuary territory in Europe, which plays such a key role in the OLB. And the famed Ulysses himself is given direct mention in the work. Keep in mind, Tacitus himself stated, quote, Ulysses, too, is believed by some in his long legendary wanderings to have found his way into this ocean, and having visited German soil, to have founded and named the town of Ascaburgium, which stands on the bank of the Rhine, and is to this day inhabited. They even say that an altar dedicated to Ulysses, with the addition of the name of his father, Laertes, was formerly discovered on this same spot, and that certain monuments and tombs with Greek inscriptions still exist on the borders of Germany and Rhaetia, end quote. And in Book 13 of his Odyssey, Homer referred to Neptune and the Phaeacians and pinned down these most revealing words, quote, But Neptune did not forget the threats with which he had already threatened Ulysses, so he took counsel with Jove. "Father Jove," said he, "I shall no longer be held in any sort of respect among you gods, if mortals like the Phaeacians, who are my own flesh and blood, show such small regard for me." End quote. As with so much written in this style, much of it is fantastical and embellished for poetic effect. For example, he claims these Phaeacians' craft were vehicles capable of flight and were controlled effortlessly by thought alone. Yet, these embellishments may well be built upon a seed of truth. And there's another fascinating story involving Alexander the Great, very reminiscent of his reported interactions with the Scythians, in which they seem to recognize a kinship and quickly turn potential hostility into fruitful alliance and friendship. Quote, "Ludger, the rear admiral of Vichard, became my comrade and later my friend. From his diary I got the following history. After we had lived at the Five Waters, Punjab, for 1200 and twice 12 years, in which our marines had explored all possible seas, Alexander the King came with a mighty army, moving downstream along the river towards our villages. No one could resist him, but we sailors living near the coast embarked with all of our portable goods and left. When Alexander learned that a great fleet had fled him, he became furious, swearing he would sacrifice all villages to the flames if we did not come back. Vichard lay ill in bed. When Alexander heard that, he waited until he got better, then he came to him, speaking most kindly, although he made threats just as before. Vichard answered, "O greatest of all kings, we sailors go everywhere. We have heard of your great deeds, so we highly respect your weapons and even more your intellect. But we are different. We are free-born, born of Freya. We can never be slaves. Even if I were to submit, the others would rather die, for that is our eternal law." Alexander replied, "I will neither take your land nor enslave your folk. All I want is to hire your services. I swear by our mutual gods that none will complain about me." When Alexander later shared bread and salt with him, Vichard chose the wisest option. He had his son retrieve the ships. End quote. Ptolemy's history claimed that the ships marshaled by Alexander totaled about 2,000, and, quote, "The sound of the simultaneous rowing by so many ships was like nothing else," end quote, with the coxswain shouting the in and out for every stroke. The riverbanks, often higher than the ships, funneled and amplified the noise, sending it reverberating from bank to bank, and here and there wooded hollows on either side acted as echo chambers. This must have been impressive to behold. From other ancient historians' accounts, it's reported that when Alexander sails into Sambagre, his ships so impressed those watching from the coast that they believed the army to be gods, and submitted immediately. Though the portrayal of Alexander in the work isn't entirely positive. Towards the end of his life, the Oera claims, quote, "Ralda deserted his soul, and in his arrogance he drowned himself in wine," end quote. And then, quote, "After his death, the empire was divided by his princes. They all were to guard a part of it for his sons, but they broke their oaths, and each of them wanted to keep and even increase his part. War broke out, and we could not return. Nearchus now wanted us to settle on the Phoenician coast, but none of us wanted that. We said we would rather risk going to Phria's land. Then he brought us to the new harbor of Athena, where to all true Phria's children used to migrate. From there, we shipped mercenaries, food supplies, and weapons," end quote. Thus sparked a return journey, much like the later Goths, back to Europe, according to the OLB. And this accords with the 17th century chronicle by Martinus Hamconius, who began his King's List with a Friso, who had allegedly migrated from India during the time of Alexander the Great. There are several references to brother and cousin peoples within Europe throughout the OLB. It tells the story of a figure named Celta and her followers creating something of a breakaway community, speaks of the British Isles initially being populated with the criminals and the shunned, and seems to speak directly about the Scots, as well as the Gauls. It also speaks to a seemingly closely related people they call the Oera, which may have an etymological connection to the Irish, though this is highly speculative, and almost certainly to Iran. And some of the noted customs and beliefs seem very similar to those of the ancient Zoroastrian element. Quote, "The Oera are not ireful, but good people, who do not tolerate or worship statues of gods. They also will not permit temples or priests, and just like us, they uphold the sacred light of Vesta, and also maintain permanent fires in their houses." End quote. The OLB speaks to several people groups, the Oera included here, that fled the rule of a corrupt priest class, much like the Frians themselves were spurred to do more than once. And bear in mind, this portion of the story, and a great portion of the overall work, takes place well beyond the more modern and recent home of the Frian people, the approximate territory we today call Friesland. They speak to living in or around, and frequent and profoundly important interactions within Greece and India, and everything in between. If anything about this portion of the work sounds implausible, I'd encourage you to dig deeper. The deeper I dive into that relevant context authored by those earliest and most trusted historians, the more I see evidence of an immense amount of migration and back and forth interconnectedness between Europe, into the Black Sea region, following the major river systems, and into India, Persia, and even the Middle East. I'd ask all listening to consider that, as individuals of European descent, our connection with the events recounted by Homer, or those of India and Persia, even Egypt and Sumer, is likely much more profound and extensive than virtually any well-known historian or thinker has publicly theorized, at least since approximately the end of World War II, in which the academic landscape shifted so violently. A man named Lawrence Austin Waddell wrote a series of explosive books in which he claimed that the king's lists in Egypt, Sumer, and India, among others, seemed to be referring to the same individuals, with similar lengths of their reigns over similar periods of time, to the extent that he felt this was beyond coincidence, and that this must have been something of a singular empire at one point, even if it was in the beginning stages of a complete fracture around the time in which more extensive histories began to be written. If science were able to chart its own natural course on this front, I think we'd have uncovered a treasure trove by this point in time. And with the aid of technology and significant effort, a wealth of outstanding questions would likely be definitively answered. Though, as it stands, research and discovery on all these fronts couldn't possibly be more hamstrung or tightly controlled. And it seems to be channeled, purposefully, down paths of extreme omission. However, not all such information can be swept under the rug so easily. At least, not before elements slip out into public view. Studies carried out by scientists from the Institute of Forensic Genetics at the University of Copenhagen have concluded that all individuals with blue eyes share a common ancestor, someone who lived 6,000 to 10,000 years ago near the area by the Black Sea. And this is the period of time and the region in which we first observe an explosion and spread of a people group most similar in physical appearance, spiritual practice, customs and traditions, and general characteristics to the later Arya. And I've come to believe the adventurous and wide-ranging spread of these very peoples led to what we call the Indo-European languages. Might it be that small pockets of this group worked conscientiously to retain their modes of thinking and living throughout the millennia to preserve their way of life, and that one of these subsets kept a surviving historical record? Over the years, as I considered what traits and attributes a surviving core element of this ancient people group might have, assuming they were a powerful and influential people, acting as something of a governing head of a confederacy, I estimated they'd probably have resided in a strategic location, for reasons both military and economic. They'd likely have the best cattle and horses, essentially the most important currency of the day. They may have a greater preponderance of fairer hair or eyes, and almost certainly be a bit taller than the norm. And I long felt they'd likely have a culture and ethos that was stubbornly freedom-oriented, even to the extreme. And again, it's important to state that the Frisians of today certainly aren't a carbon copy of the Frisians of old, and there are raging debates as to just how closely they might be related. But it's interesting to note that their cattle are famed and have since spread across the world, including our own Holstein variety in the US, and are known as the highest production dairy animals. And the Frisian horse is perhaps equally exceptional and well known, and were the type that carried many medieval knights into battle. Also, individuals currently living in the provinces of Friesland and Groningen rank as the tallest people in the world, with the average male height of 1.83 meters and 1.69 meters for women, with some of the highest percentages of fairer hair and eye color. The Netherlands is still very fertile, being the second largest exporter of agricultural goods in the world, and the coastal territory occupied by the Frisian people is of immense strategic value, atop a most important river and at the intersections between the UK, Scandinavia, Germany, and Southern Europe. And the sentence emblazoned on the North Frisian coat of arms, a motto which seems to have become something of a national characteristic and stereotype, is "Better dead than slave." They also continue, to this very day, to make use of the six-spoked Yule or sun wheel, also called the Wheel of Time or Wheel of Fortune. And as previously mentioned, it's strikingly similar to the symbol often referred to as the Flower of Life, ranking alongside the swastika as perhaps the most commonly appearing symbols across the length and breadth of the world throughout history. It also makes sense that a seagoing culture might live at or below sea level near coastal harbors, and how a significant surprise flood might serve to all but obliterate such people. And this leads us to the mystery of Doggerland, a now submerged region of land that once connected Britain to the continent. The majority of what we know about this mysterious and intriguing landmass has been uncovered not due to historians and archaeologists, eagerly searching for clues to our past, but rather as a sad testament to our age and its orientation by oil companies. It's believed to have supported over 100,000 people at one time in the distant past, and many are now speculating this was once the very heartland of Europe. It's likely that the flooding that conquered this territory happened in more than just a singular event, with the first major event likely being a tsunami, perhaps somewhere around 6000 BC. Its highest point, still visible to this day, was called Heligoland, and was recognized by both the German Kaiser and later Hitler as an extremely important base of naval operations. Something strange occurs after World War II.
This is the German island of Heligoland, the Gibraltar of the North Sea. Once a British possession, Heligoland was the key point of Germany's sea power. In World War II, it was Hitler's base for the Battle of the Atlantic. U-boat pens, gun emplacements, and underground storage tunnels are due to be blown up by thousands of tons of high explosive. They'll be fired by submarine cables and wireless transmission from the Navy ships 9 miles away. At the fourth pip of the BBC time signal, Lieutenant Commander Frank Graves of London pushes the button. "7,000 tons of bombs, depth charges, and high explosives detonate from within the island. A 12,000-foot-high column of smoke goes up. Submarine pens, coast batteries, and 8.5 miles of underground tunnels are blown sky high. It's the biggest man-made explosion since the atom bomb went off at Bikini.
And it wasn't merely obliterated, but was then pummeled with high explosive dropped by bombers with regularity for the next full decade. The entire area of Doggerland is perfectly situated and thus a likely candidate for an ancient homeland of a people like those referenced in the OLB. Burgeoning population, combined with ever-decreasing landmass, may have led not solely to massive singular flooding events in which people and cities were wiped out, but also acted as a leading cause of periodic large migrations, of that type mentioned in the OLB around 2000 BC, or that of the Goths mentioned in Jordanus Getica, approximately 1600 BC. There even exists the slight possibility that this was one large migration across a span of time, in which two branches of a population then split, only to again reunite in Europe over a millennia later. And of course, a lost large landmass, once home to an advanced people prior to a massive flood wiping them out almost entirely, opens the door to that most significant speculation regarding Atlantis, which I can't possibly cover within the scope of this video. But I will mention the intriguing and brilliant Swedish scientist and polymath Olof Rudbeck, who was all but certain this general territory was the location of that ancient land, and wrote a 2,500-page tome elaborating on the proofs. He connects the mythical Swedish king Adel to Atlas, and the Swedish mountain Atlifjäll, called Adel's Mountain, with the Atlas Mountains, and speaks to an old name for Sweden being Atland, which is, of course, a title that appears also in the Oera book. It's also important to mention that what scientists have dubbed the 4.2 kiloyear event, one of the most severe climatic events in the past 10,000 years, last occurred around 2200 BC, which aligns perfectly with the flood of 2190 BC, as recounted in the OLB. The story of a massive flood is all-pervasive in the myths and histories of several traditions, from Noah to Gilgamesh to the Norse Bergelmir or the Greek Deucalion, and standing out among so many other examples, Manu of India, a name also given to the man who developed their first civilizing laws, including the caste system. The story goes that Manu was told to build a boat to survive a coming deluge, with his family and a collection of 7 sages. In fact, the Sanskrit term for human means of Manu, or children of Manu. I'm not sure it's a coincidence that the Roman historian Tacitus speaks of the Germanic people as recounting a Manus as their progenitor. Perhaps Solon, in Plato's Timaeus, spoke the truth, and several major natural disasters in our past have essentially wiped the slate clean, leaving behind only a remnant to remember, recount, and rebuild. The genetic picture is intriguing. The haplotype R1b U106 S21 has been deemed by some the Frisian haplotype due to its high frequency in modern Frisian populations. According to this map of distribution, one can't help but recognize the extent to which it radiates outward from this lost landmass of Doggerland. In isolation, this certainly isn't hard and fast proof of anything, because as I never tire of saying, there seems to be far more movement and migration of Western peoples than any prevailing narrative suggests. But because the culture outlined in the OLB seems to be a relatively isolated seed population, willing to spread outwards but never allow foreign populations to spread inward, it may make sense, all things considered. The population grouping created by academics according to pottery style, called the corded ware and beaker peoples, are likely key to unraveling this mystery. The group labeled the Dutch beaker peoples are especially interesting, as recent data seems to indicate this was a homogeneous population, and the British beakers seem to be their descendants. Quote, R1b U106 is a patrilineal descended family that appears to descend from an ancestral R1b group located among or near the Yamnaya culture, north of the Black Sea area. The group rose to significance in the area of present Germany and the surrounding areas, probably a bit before 3000 BC. Although U106 is found all over Europe and in countries that Europeans have migrated to, it is most significant in Germany and surrounding countries, Scandinavia and Britain. In its time frame of 3000 BC, U106 likely arose in the corded ware culture. Depending on which branch of U-106 a member descends from, the people on that branch adapted to a variety of different cultures along the way, including various derivatives of Slavic, Latin, Celtic, Belgic, Saxon, Viking, and other cultural groups. U-106 is a family, not a culture." End quote. And this last bit is significant. This seems to have been a small family of elites that adapted to or helped give rise to the most prominent cultures in the region, especially the Frisian, Dutch, English, German, and Danish. In fact, a significant percentage of Europe and Scandinavia's old royal houses, as well as the Romanovs, descend from a branch of U-106, labeled DF98. A worthwhile side note here: the very discoverer of DNA, Dr. James Watson, the brilliant scientist essentially destroyed for running afoul of the politically correct mob, as well as the notable advocate for genetic genealogy, Dr. Spencer Wells, who's also been essentially blacklisted in academia due to his public opposition to illegal Israeli expansion and settlements, are both members of haplogroup R1b U-106. It's been interesting to read several accounts of what's been called a significant dividing line between Western Germanic peoples and Northern Germanic peoples, beginning very long ago and only beginning to mend around 500 AD. I believe the Western group, to which the Frisians and U-106 belongs, was likely a seafaring element of the larger family, dominating the high seas, long trade routes, and being unmatched explorers and sometimes friendly colonizers of distant shores. Whereas the northern element, likely containing the Goths or Scythians or whatever one might wish to call them, seems to instead dominate the land, from the Black Sea to northern Germany, with a Viking element that mastered the rivers on this route, and later left quite the genetic trail, visible to this day, in river-adjacent cities and settlements along the way. And to further illustrate the connection to India, it's recently been discovered that one of the specific genetic allele markers that allows the body to process lactose, common in modern European populations but far less common in others, is still found in high frequency in northern India. Quote, "Most of these have independent origins, but remarkably, the lactase persistence allele in India is the same as the European allele." End quote. As touched on in previous videos, numerous historians from the ancient to the modern spoke of the broader Germanic people group as something of a seed population, a wandering tribe from which branches constantly spring. In fact, William of Malmesbury, writing in the early 12th century, went so far as to claim that the very name itself comes from germinating so many men. Quote, "As the pruner cuts off the more luxuriant branches of the tree to impart a livelier vigor to the remainder, so the inhabitants of this country assist their common parent by the expulsion of a part of their members, lest she should perish by giving sustenance to too numerous an offspring. But in order to obviate the discontent, they cast lots who shall be compelled to migrate. Hence the men of this country made a virtue of necessity, and when driven from their native soil, have gained foreign settlements by force of arms." End quote. He gives as instances of this the Vandals, Goths, Lombards, and Normans. Everywhere we find evidence of the prevalence of this custom. The story of Hengist and Horsa is of the same kind. The custom appears to have been common to many different nations or tribes in the northern parts of Europe, and points, consequently, to the pressure of an increasing population and to diversity of origin among the settlers known as Saxons, Angles, and Jutes in England. It's also interesting to note that the term Saxon is used almost interchangeably with Frisian, or Goth, by several writers, and that in Caesar's account of the German tribes, he mentions a tribe or nation called the Cherusci at the head of a great confederation, and that as long as we find the term Cherusci used, Saxons are not mentioned. But as soon as the Cherusci disappear by name, the Saxons magically appear at the head of their own confederacy. And there's a term I've continually run across when reading histories of these peoples. Importantly, and I believe revealingly, I've heard it used only in conjunction with the Scythians, Goths, Frisians, Germans, and Saxons. It's the qualifier true, as in true Scythians, which seems to indicate there was a genuine population, and subsequently others who were less so, but later came to be known under the same label. The greatly informative historian and writer Thomas Shore lists Frisians, first and foremost, when discussing what he called the true Saxons. Quote, "The question, who were the true Saxons, i.e. the Saxons specifically so called in Germany, has been much discussed. The name may not have been a native one, but have been fixed on them by others, in which case, as Beddoe says, it is easier to believe that the Frisians were often included under it. They may have been, and probably were, a great, martial and aggressive tribe, which spread from the country along the Elbe over the country of the Weser, after conquering its previous inhabitants, the Boructari, or the Bructers. Such a migration best accounts for the later appearance of the Saxons in the region, which the Old English called Old Saxony, and erroneously looked upon as their old home, because their kindred had come to occupy it since their separation." End quote. The relationship between these two populations within the OLB seems key to understanding the broader picture. The Frians speak of having a burg and a burg maiden in Saxon lands. Initially, the Oralinde speaks of the Saxons as simple, rough, though brave and honest folk, and the dynamic between the two seems very reminiscent of the Spartans and Athenians. Though friendly, and with the Saxons being an ever more simple version of the Spartans, and the Frians being perhaps a stronger and less materialistic version of the Athenians. But over time, and from necessity, the two populations draw ever closer, until finally, when the Frians experience something of a collapse, it's mentioned that they all essentially flee to and merge with the Saxmen. A snippet of the devastation, dated to approximately 300 BC, is as follows. Quote, 8 years later, I heard that our burg maiden had been promiscuous, that some burg masters had collaborated with the Magus, and that many people were on their side. Division was everywhere. Children revolted against their parents, righteous folk were murdered in cowardly fashion. The old spinster who revealed it all was found dead in a ditch. My father, who was judge, wanted her avenged. Soon thereafter, at night, he was murdered in his home. 3 years later, the Magus ruled without resistance. The Saxmen had remained faithful and wise. To them all the good people fled. My mother died in the midst of it. Then I fled to the Saxmen like the others." End quote. It's been recently discovered that this ethnic and cultural group was responsible for early major invasions or settlements in Britain, and the initial steps in the establishment of Britain as we know her today, with genetic studies showing an almost total displacement of native Briton peoples, to the extent that the vast majority of those in Britain today are descended from this population and their later brethren, the Vikings, to a greater extent than to the more indigenous Britons. This early Saxon-Frisian settlement of Britain has been compared to the later settling of North America. To quote Thomas Shore again, quote, "They apparently point to conditions of early settlement somewhat similar to those under which the townships are formed in many instances in the western parts of the United States and Canada. There, immigrants of various European nations are forming their new homes in separate communities of their own people, while others in neighboring townships who are doing the same are of other races, and are strangers to them. The newer Anglo-Saxon race is being rejuvenated on American soil, as the older stock was by similar conditions formed in England." End quote. New Amsterdam in the United States, later to become New York, was initially almost wholly populated by Frisians. J.R.R. Tolkien and Thomas Jefferson had a special fascination with the Frisian and Saxon peoples, and both had a deep understanding of the historical context surrounding them. In fact, Tolkien was authoring Finn and Hengist as of his death, which speaks to two of the most influential figures in early Europe and a most pivotal moment. and posits that Beowulf was a tale very much rooted in historical reality. Tolkien seems to believe very strongly that the Frisians were an influential people with great reach. He speaks to Frisians in special positions in the Roman army, speaks of the English being well acquainted with them long before the Frisian and Saxon settlements and displacements began to take place, and says, quote, "After the settlement in Britain and the decline of Saxon piracy and sea power, the Frisians entered on a time of maritime prosperity and fame in the northwest. Indeed, if my final reading of this problem is correct, they were already, in the 5th century, very powerful, if not indeed the chief of the loosely connected Anglo-Frisian tribes of the northwest." End quote. The Vikings, certainly the top of the predatory food chain with few enemies to fear, seemed to raid several neighboring peoples and yet consistently avoid the home base of the Frisians. In my estimation, likely due to kinship ties and a resulting mutual respect. Though it should be mentioned, the Frisians throughout the historical period certainly seem to have an exceptional reputation with regard to martial prowess. In the OLB, it mentions a strict custom of devoting 1 day in 7 to military training. And after the pivotal reign of their first recorded king, Frisizo, said to have arrived from India, the culture gradually seemed to move to a war footing. They're mentioned as among the most effective and brutal fighters in the Crusades, and interestingly, historians of the day mentioned them uniquely and separately, by name, differentiating them from other Germanic peoples, for example, the Frisones and Teutonici. Quote, "The church knew exactly how to press the right buttons, and thus spoke about the honor of Christ that had been affected by the Saracen Muslims and the Malmuks. Honor was still an immensely important thing for the Frisians. Stories have been passed on about the Frisians leaving the battlefield to fight elsewhere when the Crusade command stalled the attack too long. They seemed always to be positively eager to fight. Apparently, as of this period, they tended to carry a round shield, a sword, and a spear of approximately 4 meters length, which in their homeland doubled as a means to jump across ditches and small creeks. Did you know the Frisians once conquered Rome? There's a fascinating saga that speaks to the Frisians being used as a special forces unit of sorts to retake Rome after a rebellion. Wikipedia states, quote, "The saga relates that Magnus was the leader of the army of Frisians in the conquest of Rome. The eyes of Pope Leo III were pulled out, and he was expelled from Rome by a group of nobles who did not accept his authority. With 700 discerning Frisians, Magnus reconquered Rome from these nobles. They entered Rome at night by a small port that had become visible through low water level in the Tiber. Through the Flavian Gardens, they went to St. Peter's, and when they were discovered there, a battle ensued. Magnus flew his banner clearly visible on the top of the church, creating confusion. There were no prisoners, and the Frisians were in St. Peter's Square up to their ankles in blood." End quote. For their exceptional service, they were then offered tremendous rewards of all varieties. Yet, true to form, they expressed no interest in these, and asked only for a promise of an eternal recognition of their freedom and independence. Though some academics consider this fanciful myth, I'm not sure why this is, as it's not only attested to in a 15th century account, but the prize they demanded, henceforth often referred to as the Carol's privilege, or Frisian privilege, was documented as being granted to them by the Holy Roman Emperors, William II and Sigismund, among others. Legend has it that Heo of Volvinga had fought in the 5th Crusade of AD 1217 and became famous for seizing the banner of the enemy during battle against the Saracens, using his trademark flail he had taken with him from the farm. When in the year AD 1147, the Crusade army was about to attack the Saracens who occupied the city of Lisbon, he addressed the soldiers, "My dear brothers, our hope rests on God, our Lord. Let us fight with joy for him and protect the land. Either we win or lose, we will be rewarded, for eternal life will be ours." After that, with great passion, they attacked, and the Frisians killed many thousands of Saracens. To mark their heroism, The Church of the Frisians in Vatican City was enlarged in the year AD 1141. The church still exists, and to this date, its pious Romanesque tower is the oldest in Vatican City. Though this enthusiastic participation in the Crusades might more justly be seen as an enthusiastic participation in warfare than an embrace or defense of the church. Perhaps more than any other people, the Frisians were extremely wary of the encroaching church. We don't have time to cover this in full within the scope of this production, but to engage in some highly speculative, educated guesswork, it seems as if the Frankish people were the first to strike a deal with the church powers, and were from this point forward used as enforcers, the military arm of the church, even battling their own kin in an attempt to bring them in line, in exchange for greatly increased wealth and power. This certainly occurred with the Goths and Frisians both, and these seem to be some of the most fierce battles of the age. Especially after reading the OLB, one might easily picture the Frisians viewing these priests as a potentially hostile element, perhaps even overtly suspect or unholy, seeking control and influence first and foremost. And this hostility to a church, seen as corrupt, certainly shouldn't be confused with a hostility to a belief in God, but rather the exact opposite. It's my opinion that their pure and deep belief was of a sort that they simply weren't able to tolerate middlemen and intermediaries whom they believed weren't truly holy men, worthy conduits with genuine intent. The church, because it inevitably doubles as such an immensely powerful influence and control mechanism, has always been a mixture of some of the best and worst, with an ever-present threat of the latter taking the reins completely, the moment a profound vigilance and watchfulness ceased. To interject my own opinion here, I think our present Pope and his circle of leadership in the Vatican proves their instincts correct. And to end this part 2 of a 3-part series, here is how they describe this foreign force. Quote, "Among Finda's folk there are witty men who, by their over-inventiveness, have become so corrupted that they convince themselves and their initiates that they are the best part of Ralda, that their mind is the best part of Ralda's spirit, and that Ralda can only think by their help. The notion that every creature is part of Ralda's infinite being, that they have taken from us. But their false reasoning and ungovernable pride have caused them to stray from the righteous path. If their mind was like Ralda's spirit, then Ralda would be very stupid, instead of being sensible and wise. For their minds always work like slaves, creating beautiful images which they afterwards worship. Rather, Finda's folk are a bad folk, for although their pseudo-wise men convince themselves that they are divine, they have created false divinities for the uninitiated, everywhere proclaiming that these divinities have created the world with all that is therein. Greedy divinities, full of envy and wrath, who want to be honored and served by the people, who want blood and sacrifice and demand rich offerings." End quote. And finally, we've covered in previous videos how both Goths and Scythians' leadership and royal lineages experienced numerous strange deaths due to poison, especially around the time of Justinian and Theodoric. In the OLB, in the final lines attributed to the Minos of legend, he pins this last anecdote and piece of advice. Quote, "Once I found poison in my food. So on one occasion, when a ship from the Fleet sailed among us, I quietly took my leave. My own adventures aside, I merely want to say with this history that we cannot live together with Finda's folk, from wherever they may be, because they are full of false tricks, as much to be feared as their sweet wine with deadly poison." End quote. Until next time.